I rescued my 15-year-old grandson from a shelter, a place I never thought I'd be in a position to deal with. He was broken, skeletal, bruised all over his fragile body. He looked nothing like the boy I had once known. His spirit, just like his body, was shattered. When I took him home with me, I made a silent promise to myself that I would do everything in my power to fix him, to help him heal. What I didn't know was that it wouldn't just be his body that needed mending, but his heart, his trust in people, and his belief in the goodness of the world. 17 years later, my grandson, Ethan, had become a trauma surgeon. It was his way of putting all the pieces together, learning how to fix things, learning how to heal, not just bodies, but the souls of people who came into his care. But then came that fateful night, the night when the woman who had put him in that shelter, the one who had abandoned him when he needed her the most, was wheeled into his ER, nearly beaten to death. She was my daughter, Rebecca, the woman I once loved unconditionally, but also the one who had failed him. Now she was lying there, dying, a victim of the very kind of violence she had let destroy her son for years. Ethan stood over her, scalpel in hand. The backup surgeon was 45 minutes away. She had maybe 10 minutes left. In that moment, he faced a choice, a gut-wrenching one. He could walk away, let someone else handle it, or he could do what he had been trained to do, save a life. He could save the woman who had discarded him, who had never been there when he needed her the most. And as he stood there, frozen, the weight of that decision crushed him. Could he be the person who had once been broken, only to rise above it all? Or would he allow his pain to shape his actions? This is the story of that night, and this is my story. I'm Joan, and at the age of 77, I've learned a lot about life, about family, and about the complicated nature of love. But more importantly, I've learned that sometimes the hardest things to do are the right ones. Before we go any further, I want to ask a favor. If you're watching this, leave a comment and tell us where you're tuning in from. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And don't forget to subscribe to Never Too Old. We're building a community of people who know that the best chapters of life can happen at any age, no matter what we face. Now, let me take you back in time. It was a regular shift at the ICU. I was checking a patient's IV line when the phone rang. I glanced at the caller ID, and the name that flashed on the screen froze me in my tracks. Mrs. Alvarez. I'd been waiting for this call for 3 long years. My heart beat louder in my chest as I stepped out of the room, trying to steady myself. "Joan, it's Miss Alvarez from Oakwood Drive in Riverside. Your grandson, he showed up at the youth shelter 2 nights ago. I just found out this morning from another neighbor who volunteers there. She recognized him and called me right away." I could feel my stomach drop. Mrs. Alvarez had been the one person I could rely on after Rebecca's fall from grace. The one person who watched out for Ethan when I couldn't. But now my worst fears were coming true. "Which shelter?" I whispered. "Hammond Street," Mrs. Alvarez replied. "Joan, I'm so sorry. I didn't know sooner." I took a deep breath, forcing myself to sound calm. "It's okay. Thank you for calling." I hung up the phone, my mind racing. 3 years. 3 years of waiting for this call. I'd known something was wrong, but I couldn't prove it. I had to act fast. I grabbed my purse, told my supervisor it was a family emergency, and left the hospital without a second thought. 2 hours later, I was driving to Riverside. My hands were shaking on the wheel, but I had to keep going. I've been thinking about this a lot lately. It's funny, how your mind works when you're on the road to something like this. You'd think I'd be focused on driving, on getting there as fast as possible, but instead I kept seeing Rebecca in my mind, 23 years old, standing in my kitchen with Danny's arm around her waist. Danny had seemed nice enough at first, quiet, worked at the hardware store. He was good to Rebecca, and then Ethan came along. I was in the delivery room when Ethan was born. Danny held him like he was made of glass, gentle and proud. But things changed when Ethan turned 3. Danny left. No fight, no warning, just gone one morning with half of the furniture and Rebecca's savings account emptied. That was the start of her downward spiral. Rebecca had always been fragile, never quite recovering from the loss of her father when she was just a little girl. And when Danny left, I knew it was going to break her. She had Ethan to care for, but she didn't know how to hold it all together. She started drinking more and more. At first, it was just 1 glass of wine at night, then 2, then a whole bottle. I'd find Ethan sitting in front of the TV eating cereal for dinner when Rebecca was passed out on the couch. I tried to help. I'd bring groceries, watch Ethan on the weekends. I even had the hard conversation with Rebecca, the one you have with your child when you see them spiraling out of control. She'd cry, promise to do better. And for a week or 2, she would, but then it would all fall apart again. I've always tried to be there for Rebecca. I wanted to believe she could pull herself together. And then one day she called me about a man she'd met at a bar. Carl, she said, was charming, didn't mind that she had a child. I should have known better. Any man who says he doesn't care that you have a kid is lying. But Rebecca was so happy, so excited. I agreed to meet Carl, invited him over for Thanksgiving. He showed up wearing a leather jacket, his handshake too firm, his eyes darting around the room like he was sizing everything up. Dinner was uneventful until Rebecca forgot his beer. When she brought it out to him, Carl grabbed her wrist. His fingers turned white around her skin, and he smiled while doing it. "Don't forget again," he said, his grip tight, possessive. Rebecca laughed it off like it was nothing, but I knew better. I took her aside afterward and warned her, told her that man was dangerous. She didn't listen. The next few months were a blur. I saw the bruises on Rebecca's arms, the yellowing mark on her collarbone that she said came from bumping into a door. Ethan got quieter. He was only 7, but I could see the change in him. I tried to reach out, tried to ask if everything was okay, but Rebecca refused to see it. She'd hang up on me when I asked about Carl, dismissing it like I was being paranoid. And then one day, out of the blue, she called to tell me they were moving to Riverside. Carl had gotten a job there. A fresh start, she called it. But I knew better. I drove to Riverside the day they moved in. I helped unpack boxes and brought a casserole. The house was small, dark. Carl stayed outside the whole time, smoking. Inside, Rebecca looked worn down, thinner. I tried to talk to her, tried to tell her what I saw, but she refused to listen. I saw the bruises. I saw the fear in Ethan's eyes. But she didn't care. Not enough to change anything. I left that day, heartbroken. I knew Rebecca was trapped in a cycle, but it was clear she didn't want to see it. She was so desperate to hold on to Carl, even if it meant sacrificing her own well-being, her son's well-being. I had always believed that a mother would protect her child, but Rebecca's actions were showing me otherwise. She had already given up on Ethan once in that courthouse, and I couldn't make her see that she was making the same mistake again. That night, as I drove home, I cried so hard that I had to pull over twice. I didn't understand it. How could she do this to Ethan? To herself? To me? I was ready to give up on her, to walk away, but I couldn't. I couldn't leave Ethan behind. He was all I had left of my daughter, the one person who mattered more than anything else. I told myself I wouldn't stop trying. The next day, Rebecca called. Her voice sounded rehearsed, as if she was saying the words Carl had told her to. "Mom, don't come back. We need space. Carl says you're undermining our relationship." She hung up before I could say anything. And that was the last time I heard from her. I was left standing there, in my kitchen, with nothing but the sound of my own heartbeat, aching, alone. For 3 years, I tried reaching out to her, but I couldn't. Every time I called, her number had changed. Every time I visited, no one answered. I felt like I was losing her all over again. But then one day, Mrs. Alvarez, the neighbor I had trusted, called again. She had seen Ethan getting out of their car once more, but this time he looked different, thinner. She was concerned. She heard shouting through the walls some nights. It was enough to make me panic. I knew I had to do something, but I couldn't act without evidence. So I waited. 2 days later, I got the call from Mrs. Alvarez that would change everything. Ethan had shown up at the Hammond Street Youth Shelter. I couldn't believe it. My heart raced as I grabbed my purse, said goodbye to my supervisor, and headed out of the hospital. I knew this was the moment I had been waiting for, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like everything was falling apart, and yet it felt like the only chance I had left to make things right. I drove to Riverside that day. The journey felt endless, but the idea of what I might find, what Ethan might have gone through, kept me going. I was afraid, but I was determined. I had to find him. I had to take him home, back to safety, back to where he belonged. When I reached the Hammond Street Youth Shelter, I stood there for a moment before stepping inside. The woman at the desk looked up, and I immediately asked for Ethan. She hesitated, but after a moment, she stood up, motioned for me to wait, and went down a hallway. My heart was in my throat. Then when Ethan came into the room, I couldn't believe it was him. I almost didn't recognize him. He was so thin. His clothes hung off his body, and his face, it looked like he had been through a war. Bruises covered his arms and legs. His lip was split, barely healed. His eyes were hollow, and he wouldn't look at me. He was broken, inside and out. I felt tears welling up, but I forced them back. I couldn't break down. Not now, not in front of him, not when I was supposed to be the one who held it all together. I got up slowly, walked toward him, and asked, "Can I hug you?" He nodded, and when I wrapped my arms around him, he broke down in my arms. His sobs were silent at first, but then they turned to cries, so raw and heartbreaking, I couldn't hold back my tears anymore. I just held him, letting him cry into my shoulder until his sobs turned into shudders and his breathing began to slow. It was a release for both of us. Ethan had always been a quiet child, but now it felt like he was a shell of the boy I once knew. I didn't know how to help him, how to fix him. The damage was so much deeper than I had realized. When we finally left the shelter, I brought him to my car. He sat in the passenger seat, still staring at the side mirror, his eyes darting back and forth like he expected someone to come running after him. He didn't say a word the entire ride home. I didn't try to make him talk. I let him sit in silence. I didn't know what else to do. When we arrived at my house, I let him inside. It was a small, humble place, but it was home. The guest room had been ready for him for 3 years. I had prepared for this moment, for his return, even when I had no idea if it would ever come. I showed him around, and when we reached the guest room, I said, "This is yours. You can lock the door if you want to. The bathroom's across the hall. Everything you need is here." He didn't respond. He just stood there, looking at the bed, as though he didn't know what to do with the space, as though he had never had a place of his own, never had a home that felt safe. I didn't press him. I gave him time to heal, time to adjust. After a while, I gently told him, "I need to check those bruises, Ethan. Can you take your shirt off for me?" He did so slowly, like every movement caused him pain. His ribs were covered in dark purple bruises, and some of them were still fresh. The scars on his back told stories of violence and neglect, reminders of a life no child should ever have to endure. His collarbones jutted out sharply, and his arms were covered in wounds of various stages of healing. I touched his shoulder gently, and he flinched. I apologized and promised him I would always tell him before I touched him from now on. He nodded, but his eyes were distant, like he was somewhere else, reliving what had been done to him. The first night, I gave him a glass of water, some acetaminophen for the pain, and told him to rest. He didn't say much, but he ate the soup I made for him, slowly, cautiously. It was like he was afraid someone would take it away if he ate too quickly. We went through the motions of the night. I showed him where the towels were, the soap, the toothbrush. I told him I was right next door, that he could come to me any time. But he didn't move from his bed. He just stayed there, curled up, facing the door. In the following days, I watched him start to heal, slowly, so slowly. He started to eat more. He gained weight, though it would take a while before he regained the strength that he had lost. But most importantly, he started to speak again. He started asking me about my work, about my life, small, normal things that had once been his routine, things that felt like miracles to me. One day, he surprised me by saying he wanted to be a doctor. I was taken aback at first. "You'd be good at that," I said, even though I didn't know what he meant. But when he explained that he wanted to help people, to fix things that were broken because he knew what it felt like to need someone to put him back together, my heart swelled with pride. The months passed. He continued therapy. He continued to work on himself, on healing. It wasn't easy. Nothing about his journey would ever be easy. But he was becoming stronger, more confident, and slowly he began to shine again. Ethan's path wasn't linear. There were setbacks. There were days when I could hear him crying in his room late at night. But there were also breakthroughs. There were moments when he would smile, when he would laugh. There were nights when he would sit with me at the kitchen table, telling me about his day. He was becoming the person I always knew he could be. And then one day, as I stood in the hospital with him, watching him perform his first surgery as an attending trauma surgeon, I realized just how far he had come. The boy I had once held in my arms, broken and frail, was now saving lives. He was the one putting people back together, just as he had done for himself. But even as he excelled in his career, even as he grew in his confidence and his ability, there was always that part of him that was still broken. That part that would never be the same, no matter how much time passed. As the years passed, I saw Ethan transform into someone I barely recognized, but in the best possible way. He was no longer the terrified, silent boy I had pulled out of that shelter. He was strong, confident, and determined. He had become a trauma surgeon, the very thing he once dreamt of being, even though that dream had been born from pain, loss, and a need to heal the broken parts of himself. By the time he completed his residency, I had already retired from nursing. My body was slowing down, but my mind was still sharp. I spent my days cooking for Ethan, doing his laundry, and trying to keep his life in balance. He worked so many hours, 80 to 100-hour weeks as a resident, but he never complained. He was committed to his path, and when he told me he wanted to specialize in trauma surgery, I could hear the conviction in his voice. He wasn't just choosing a field. He was choosing to confront the kind of pain that had once broken him. I knew that his decision to go into trauma surgery wasn't just about the work. It was about the catharsis it provided him. He wanted to help people, yes, but more than that, he wanted to take control over something that had once been out of his hands. He wanted to be the one who put things back together, the way he had learned to do with himself. It wasn't easy. The trauma fellowship was intense. Long hours, high stakes, constant pressure. But Ethan thrived in it. I watched him grow more confident in his skills, and he started teaching residents. He was no longer the young man who was afraid of his past. He had turned that pain into something powerful, something good. He had taken every piece of his brokenness and used it to build himself up again. He came home one night, his face tired but triumphant, and told me about a patient he had saved in surgery. A man who had been in a motorcycle accident, his body broken, his life hanging in the balance. Ethan had been the one to fix him, the one to keep him alive. When I looked at him that night, I saw not only the surgeon, but also the boy I had once cradled in my arms. The boy who was now saving others, putting them back together the way I had done for him. Then came that night, the night that would bring everything full circle. I had no idea what was coming, but I remembered the phone call. The phone rang in the middle of the night, its shrill tone cutting through the silence. I didn't recognize the number, but I answered anyway. "Joan, it's Ethan." His voice was strained, different from how it usually sounded. "I need you to come to the hospital. It's Mom. She's here." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My mind raced and the memories of the past flooded back. Rebecca, my daughter, the woman who had abandoned her son and broken my heart. The woman who had hurt him, who had turned her back on him when he needed her most. My breath caught in my throat and I could barely form words. Is she all right?" Ethan didn't answer right away. I could hear the weight of the situation in his silence. "She's alive," he finally said. "But barely. She's been beaten nearly to death." I could feel my heart sink as the reality of it hit me. Rebecca, my daughter, was in the ER, and my grandson, the very child she had abandoned, was now the one who had to save her life. I didn't wait another second. I jumped out of bed and dressed quickly, my hands shaking as I fumbled with my clothes. I didn't know what to think, what to feel. My mind was racing, my heart in my throat. I was going to the hospital, to the very place where Ethan worked, to the place where he had saved so many lives. But now, he was standing over the woman who had hurt him, over the woman who had let him down. By the time I arrived at the hospital, the sky was still dark and the parking lot was nearly empty. I rushed to the ER, and there, sitting in the waiting room, was Ethan, still in his scrubs, looking exhausted, worn out, but strangely composed. His face was pale, his eyes shadowed with something I couldn't read. He didn't say anything when he saw me. He just stood up and walked over to me, his eyes filled with so many emotions I couldn't begin to understand. He said quietly, his voice almost breaking, "I did it. I saved her. I operated on her." The words hit me like a ton of bricks. My grandson, the boy whom had been abandoned, the one who had been beaten and broken, had saved the life of the woman who put him in that position. Ethan had to make a decision in that operating room, a decision no one should ever have to make. He could have walked away. He could have let someone else take over. He could have let her die. But he didn't. He remembered the vows he took when he became a doctor. He remembered what I told him years ago, that sometimes the hardest thing to do is the right thing. He could have chosen to let the past dictate his actions, but he chose to rise above it. He chose to be the man he had become, not the broken boy he once was. I knew it had been difficult for him. The memories must have flooded back as he stood over her body, as he fought to keep her alive. But he did it. He saved her. When Rebecca woke up, she was a different woman. She looked at me, her face full of confusion, but when she saw Ethan, the pain in her eyes was unmistakable. She had always been broken, but now, seeing her in the ICU, knowing what she had put Ethan through, knowing that he had saved her, was almost too much to bear. She tried to speak, but her voice was weak. "Ethan," she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "I'm sorry." The words felt hollow coming from her. It was too little, too late. She had never been there when he needed her. She had chosen Carl over him, over her own son. But Ethan, in his quiet strength, had done what she couldn't. He had saved her life. The weeks that followed were a blur of legal proceedings, therapy sessions, and attempts at healing. Ethan had to testify against Carl, the man who had abused him, the man who had destroyed so much of his life. I was proud of Ethan. He was doing everything he could to make sure Carl would never hurt anyone again. The courtroom became his battleground. But this time, he wasn't fighting for himself. He was fighting for the future, for a chance to live without the shadow of Carl hanging over him. The trial lasted for weeks, but in the end, Carl was sentenced to 20 years in prison. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough, but it was something. And as the years passed, Ethan continued to build a life that was his, a life that no one could take away from him. A year later, Ethan and I sat at the kitchen table having dinner together like we always did. He told me about his day, about the patients he had saved, about the lives he had touched. He had become the kind of doctor I always knew he could be: compassionate, capable, strong. We sat there side by side, and I realized that he had made it. Despite everything that had happened, despite the years of pain and suffering, he had found a way to heal. Not just himself, but others. I smiled at him, knowing that whatever happened next, we both had come out of the darkness stronger, together. That's my story. It's the story of how love, even when it's broken, can heal. Of how a child can become a man who saves lives. Of how sometimes the hardest thing to do is the right thing. Ethan's journey wasn't easy. He fought for everything he had. But now he's exactly where he needs to be. And so am I. Watching him succeed, knowing how far he's come, is the greatest reward I could ever ask for. Now, I'd love to hear from you. Do you think Ethan should ever forgive Rebecca? Or should he continue to keep his distance? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed my story, don't forget to subscribe for more. This is just one chapter in a lifetime of stories. We all have our own. What's yours?
Every day, he was a reminder of how far he had come. I watched him with a sense of awe as he operated on his patients, saving lives with the same hands that once shook in fear, that once trembled with the weight of his own trauma. Those hands, which had been bound by the chains of his past, were now instruments of healing. His hands, steady and precise, had the power to rebuild what had once been broken. There were still moments when he seemed distant, when the ghosts of his past seemed to haunt him. I could see it in his eyes when he spoke of his patients, when he described the pain they were in. It was as if, in those moments, he wasn't just treating them, he was reliving his own suffering. The nightmares still came, and some nights I would find him sitting up in bed, his face pale and drawn, his body trembling from the memories that refused to let him go. But every time he woke up from those dreams, he would remind himself of who he was now. He was no longer the scared little boy in the shelter, no longer the one who had been abandoned and left to fend for himself. He was a trauma surgeon, someone who could take on the darkest parts of humanity and still rise above them. That night, when Ethan operated on his mother, Rebecca, I knew he had finally found peace with the man he had become. It wasn't about forgiveness. It wasn't about excusing what she had done. It was about understanding that he had the power to decide how he would live his life, how he would move forward, and that he no longer needed to carry the weight of his past with him. I had always known that Ethan was strong, but that night, when he saved Rebecca's life, I saw the full extent of his strength. It wasn't the physical strength to perform a life-saving surgery under extreme pressure. It was the emotional strength to look at the woman who had abandoned him and say, "I will save your life, even if you never saved mine." After that night, I stayed by Ethan's side, just as I had all those years ago. He wasn't the same boy I had rescued from the shelter. He wasn't the same broken soul I had once held in my arms. But he was still my grandson, and he still needed me, even if he didn't always show it. There were times when he would call me, his voice breaking, asking if I could come to the hospital, just to sit with him, to be there, when the weight of it all became too much. I would drop everything and rush to him, just as I had done when he was younger. I was still the same person I had been when I first took him in, when I first promised him that he was safe with me. But now, I wasn't just his protector. I was his partner in this journey, his confidant, the one who would always stand beside him. Rebecca, on the other hand, remained a complicated presence in our lives. When she woke up after the surgery, her first words to Ethan were full of apologies. She was broken, but her apologies were hollow. I could see it in her eyes. She wanted to take it all back, wanted to undo the years of neglect, the years of pain she had caused him. But she couldn't. And Ethan, in his quiet way, knew that. He had already given up on her. Not because he hated her, but because he had realized that sometimes the best thing you can do for someone who has hurt you is to walk away. That night, as I sat with him in the hospital, watching Rebecca recover, I knew that the hardest part of this journey was still ahead of us. The healing, the true healing, hadn't yet begun. Rebecca would never be the mother Ethan needed. She would never be the person he had hoped for. But he had me. He had family. And that was enough. As the days passed, I continued to watch Ethan rebuild his life, brick by brick. He started applying to medical schools, filling out his applications, writing his essays, and beginning to take ownership of the future he had always dreamed of. I could see the determination in his eyes. The quiet ambition that had always been there, buried under the pain, was now at the surface. He was going to make something of himself. He was going to build the life he had always wanted, and nothing, not even his past, was going to stand in his way. It wasn't all easy, though. There were still moments when the weight of his past would come crashing down on him. I remember one night after he received his acceptance letter from State University, when he came home late, holding the letter in his hands. His face was a mixture of joy and disbelief. He was finally going to medical school. He was finally going to live the life he had always dreamed of. But as he stood there in front of me, tears welled up in his eyes. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. I knew what he was feeling. He was proud of himself, but he was also carrying the ghosts of everything that had led him here. And as much as I wanted to shield him from it all, I knew I couldn't. The past was never going to go away. It would always be a part of him. But I also knew that he had become so much stronger because of it. We celebrated that night, of course, but it was bittersweet. Ethan had achieved a monumental thing, but it wasn't without sacrifice. And as he moved forward, I knew that his path would continue to be one of both triumph and struggle. The first day he started medical school, I was there. I watched him walk into the lecture hall, his head held high, his posture confident. He didn't look back at me. He didn't need to. He was finally walking into the future he had always deserved. And I was proud of him. Proud in a way that only a mother or grandmother could be.
But it wasn't just pride. It was also a deep sense of relief. I had watched this boy, this young man, go through hell. I had watched him suffer in ways no one should ever have to. And now here he is, standing tall, ready to change the world. As Ethan went through medical school, we continued our Sunday dinners. It became our tradition, just the two of us, sitting at the kitchen table, eating simple meals and talking about anything and everything. Those dinners became the cornerstone of our relationship. They were the times when Ethan let down his guard and shared his thoughts, his worries, and his hopes for the future. It was during these dinners that I realized how much he had changed, how much he had healed. He was no longer the scared little boy I had rescued from the shelter. He was no longer the one who had been abandoned and left to fend for himself. He was a trauma surgeon, someone who could take on the darkest parts of humanity and still rise above them. But I'm proud of his accomplishments. There was one thing that still hung over us: Rebecca. She was out of our lives for the most part. She didn't come to see us. She didn't ask about Ethan unless I brought him up first. She was trying to heal, but I could see the emptiness in her. She had chosen Carl over her son. She had abandoned him when he needed her the most, and now she was trying to make amends, but the damage had already been done. There were still days when Ethan would ask about her. "Do you think she's okay?" he would ask, his voice quiet, unsure. And every time I would tell him the same thing. "I don't know, honey, but you don't have to worry about her anymore. You're safe now. You've built your own life, and no one can take that away from you." It was after his graduation from medical school that I realized just how far Ethan had come. He stood there in his cap and gown, receiving his degree, surrounded by his friends and classmates. I watched him walk across the stage, his shoulders straight, his head held high. He was the man I had always hoped he would become. And later that day, he found me in the parking lot. He was holding his cap in one hand, his gown unzipped, a grin on his face. He said, "I wouldn't be here without you." I smiled at him, my heart swelling with love. I said, "Yes, you would. You're stronger than you know." And in that moment, I knew that no matter what came next, we had made it. Together. He struggled at times. The pressure, the long hours, the overwhelming responsibility. But he pushed through, always moving forward. I saw the stress on his face, the exhaustion in his eyes, but I also saw the determination. He had a goal, a purpose. He wanted to heal, not just physically, but emotionally. He was driven by something deeper than ambition. It was the understanding of pain, of suffering, of what it felt like to be broken and to have no one to help. That was his strength. We had our moments of doubt, though. There were times when he doubted himself, when the weight of his past seemed to haunt him in the quiet of the night. Sometimes he would come to me after a long day, sit with me at the kitchen table, and simply say, "I don't know if I can do this anymore." And I would tell him the same thing every time. "You've made it this far, haven't you? You can do anything. Don't let the past steal your future." Those words became our mantra. When things felt overwhelming, when the world seemed too much to bear, we would remember that. We had come so far, and the future was worth fighting for. After his graduation, Ethan started his residency. It was the next step in his path, the next challenge, and it came with even more responsibility. He was working long shifts, seeing patients, performing surgeries, and handling emergencies. Every day he faced the kind of pressure that would have broken most people. But Ethan wasn't like most people. He had been through hell and had come out the other side stronger. He had seen the darkest parts of life and had learned how to overcome them. He was a survivor. There were still moments, though, when I would catch him staring out the window late at night, lost in thought. I knew what he was thinking. He was still carrying the weight of the past, even if he didn't always show it. but he had learned how to manage it, how to compartmentalize it. He had learned how to live with his scars without letting them define him. Then, one evening, he came home after a particularly grueling day at the hospital. He was drained, his face pale, his body worn from the long hours. He slumped into the chair across from me at the kitchen table and sighed deeply, running his hairs through his head. "I don't know how much longer I can do this, Grandma," he said, his voice heavy. "Every day I'm surrounded by people who are broken, and I see myself in them. I see the same pain in their eyes that I once had. It's hard to keep going." I sat quietly for a moment, letting his words sink in. I knew what he meant. I knew that he was carrying a heavy burden, one that wasn't just physical, but emotional. He had chosen a career that forced him to confront his own trauma day in and day out. It wasn't just about saving lives. It was about confronting the darkest parts of humanity, the parts that he had buried deep inside himself. But I also knew that he was stronger than that pain, stronger than he realized. "You've already done the hardest thing, Ethan," I told him softly. "You've faced your past. You've healed yourself, even when it seemed impossible. This, what you're doing now, it's just a part of your journey. You'll make it through. I know you will." The next few years flew by in a blur. Ethan continued his residency, and then, when the time came, he applied for fellowships. Trauma surgery was always his passion. It was what he had always wanted to do, to be the person who saved others in their darkest moments. It wasn't just about being a surgeon. It was about making a difference. It was about using his own experiences to help others who were suffering in ways that he understood all too well. He received an acceptance letter for a prestigious fellowship in trauma surgery, and I could see the excitement in his eyes. It was the culmination of everything he had worked for. He was finally going to be the trauma surgeon he had always dreamed of being. But with that excitement also came fear. The fellowship was going to be intense, and Ethan wasn't sure if he was ready. There were nights when he would sit up, staring at the ceiling, wondering if he could handle it. But I knew he could. I knew that no matter how difficult it got, he would rise to the challenge. As he began his fellowship, I saw him change once more. He was no longer the young man who was unsure of himself, the one who carried the weight of his past in every step. He was confident, skilled, and determined. He had found his rhythm. The trauma surgeries he performed were some of the most complex, and he tackled each case with precision and focus. He was becoming the doctor I always knew he could be, someone who would make a difference, who would heal not just bodies, but souls. But even as he thrived in his career, there were days when the past would catch up with him. The memories of what he had endured, the scars that still lingered would surface. I could see it in the way his hands would tremble after a particularly difficult surgery, or in the way he would close himself off after a particularly tough case. I knew it wasn't easy. I knew that he was still fighting battles that no one could see. Then came that night, the night when everything changed. It started like any other. Ethan had been working long hours at the hospital, running trauma cases, performing surgeries, doing what he was trained to do. But that night, when the ambulance arrived, everything shifted. It was a domestic violence case. A woman in her mid-50s, beaten severely. Her face was swollen, her abdomen distended, her vitals dangerously low. Ethan was in the trauma bay when they wheeled her in. He started his rapid assessment, already thinking about the possible injuries: ruptured spleen, liver damage, internal bleeding. And then, as he looked at her face, his world stopped. Rebecca Cooper Williams, the nurse read from the paramedic's chart. His mother, the woman who had abandoned him, the woman who had caused him so much pain. There she was, in his ER, dying, and he was the one who had to save her. In that moment, Ethan had a choice. He could have walked away. He could have let someone else handle it. No one would have blamed him. But instead, he did the hardest thing he could have done. He chose to save her life, not because she deserved it, but because he had become the man he was meant to be, a healer. I didn't know what to think when Ethan called me that night. I could hear the tension in his voice. The weight of the decision he had made was heavy, but he'd done what was right. He had operated on Rebecca and he had saved her life. It wasn't about forgiveness. It wasn't about understanding. It was about doing what needed to be done, even when it seemed impossible. I arrived at the hospital just after the surgery, my heart heavy with so many emotions. I found Ethan sitting outside the ICU, his face pale, his eyes filled with exhaustion. But there was something else there, something I hadn't seen before. Peace. 3 days later, Rebecca woke up. Her first words were not to Ethan. They were to me. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice shaking. She looked at me, her eyes full of guilt, regret, and sorrow. But it wasn't enough. It would never be enough. Ethan didn't visit her. He didn't want to. He didn't owe her anything. But I saw him struggle with it. I saw the pain in his eyes as he sat beside me, thinking about what had been done to him and what he had just done for her. The trial came shortly after that. Carl, Rebecca's husband, was arrested for attempted murder. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Ethan testified, calmly and with conviction. He spoke about the abuse, the years of suffering, the trauma he had endured. It was hard to listen to, but it was necessary. Ethan needed to confront his past to make sure Carl would never hurt anyone again. The trial ended with a conviction, and Carl was sentenced to 20 years in prison. It wasn't justice, not the kind Ethan deserved, but it was something. It was enough to keep him away from Rebecca, and that was all that mattered. As the months passed, I continued to watch Ethan grow. He had become the man I always knew he could be, strong, compassionate, and filled with purpose. He continued his work as a trauma surgeon, saving lives and making a difference. He had healed, and in doing so, he had become a healer for others. And then, one day, years later, he said something that filled me with pride and love. "I saw Mom last week," he said, his voice calm. "I ran into her at the grocery store where she works. It was awkward, but I think it's okay." I looked at him, searching his face for any signs of pain, of regret, but all I saw was acceptance. He had forgiven her, in his own way, not because she deserved it, but because he had learned to live his life on his own terms. And so, here we are. Ethan is now a successful trauma surgeon, and I am proud of the man he has become. He is still healing, still learning, but he is no longer broken. He has found peace, and I have found peace in knowing that I did everything I could to help him. We've both come a long way, and while our journey hasn't been easy, it has been worth every step. This is our story, my grandson's story, and mine. We've both been through hell, but we've made it out the other side, together. Ethan's journey was never going to be easy, but he proved that no matter how broken you are, you can still rise. From the broken boy who once lay in a shelter, abandoned and bruised, to the man who now saves lives every day, Ethan's story is one of resilience, strength, and redemption. It wasn't just about surviving, it was about thriving. It was about taking what life handed him and finding a way to turn it into something meaningful. The pain didn't define him. His ability to heal, to help others, to put people back together, that became his true calling. As for me, I am grateful that I could be there for him, that I could help him find his way back to the light, that I could watch him become the man he is today. Watching him succeed, seeing him move forward in his life, makes all the sacrifices worth it. Ethan doesn't need me the way he used to, and that's okay. He's grown into someone who doesn't just need to be saved, he's someone who saves others. And as a grandmother, there's no greater pride than that. So that's the end of our story. My story. Ethan's story. We've made it through the darkest parts of our lives and come out stronger. We've healed, we've learned, and we've found peace. And no matter what happens next, no matter what the future holds, I know one thing for certain. We'll face it together. Thank you for listening. If you've been through your own struggles, if you've faced pain and loss, know that you're not alone. There's always a way forward. Sometimes all it takes is one person to show you the way, to remind you that you can heal and that you can become the person you are meant to be. So take care of yourselves and never forget that no matter how old you are, your best chapters are still ahead of you. Thank you again for being a part of this journey, and remember, we're all in this together. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to leave a comment and subscribe to the Never the End Story channel. We'd love to hear your thoughts and be a part of your story too.